Thank you very much. Be very welcome to this NPT at 50 roundtable. You know that one of the side effects of this coronavirus crisis was that this meeting was intended to be face-to-face, but we had to do it online. And another side effect of the current situation is that probably the most important multilateral meeting in this year's calendar, which was the NPT RevCon, had to be postponed. As you know, the perspectives for that meeting were not particularly optimistic. So we can understand this sort of postponement as a new chance to reflect together on the importance on the NPT and to reflect on what is to be expected from this NPT RevCon. And when I mean us, I mean the whole non-proliferation and disarmament community, not only the state parties, but also academia, also researchers, members of the public opinion, civil society, and so on and so forth. So this is, this roundtable can contribute to that collective effort. And for that, we have gathered a series of panelists who are professors and researchers and have devoted at least one part of their time to trying to analyze or to unveil different aspects of the NPT. Before passing the floor to them, I would like to refer to three main questions in order to a little bit set the tone of this debate. The first one would be, what is the NPT? Well, I understand that you are perfectly familiar, but there might be some people who have connected to this roundtable who are not particularly familiar to the NPT. Well, the NPT is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is like the cornerstone of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. It's a treaty that was negotiated in the 60s. It came into force in 1970. And basically, it's a big bargain between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. Nuclear weapon states commit themselves not to transfer the nuclear weapon to any other member of the international community, whereas the non-nuclear weapon states commit not to develop, not to possess the nuclear weapons. There is also a general global commitment to pursue the Pacific developments of the nuclear energy, and there is also a very important commitment by the nuclear weapon states to undertake, in good faith, negotiations for nuclear disarmament. It's a famous endeavor clause enshrined in Article 6 of the NPT. Now, the second question, why is the NPT so important? Well, the NPT has witnessed over its history the milestones of the non-proliferation regime. Since the creation of the nuclear weapons-free zones, the negotiation and adoption of the CTBT, the relinquishing of their own nuclear weapons stockpiles by some countries, for example, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Ukraine, or South Africa. It has witnessed also a big reduction in terms of nuclear stockpiles by the big superpowers. Let's remember that by the end of the 80s, there were more than 68,000 nuclear warheads, and now we are speaking about 14 or 15,000 warheads, which means a reduction of almost 80%. I mean, many things have happened, and many good things have happened over the history of the NPT. But most of all, the NPT is important because to some extent it contributed not to, to prevent the prophecy of President Kennedy at the beginning of the 60s. You know that President Kennedy in 1961 said that in 10 years' time, there would be more than 30 countries having access to the nuclear weapon. Well, now we are in 2020, and that's not the case. So the contribution of the NPT to that reality is a very important one. Even if today the nuclear weapon proliferation is still a major concern of the international community, even if today there is enough fissile material in the world to produce more than 200,000 nuclear weapons, the reality is that nuclear proliferation has somehow been contained. And that's in part thanks to this umbrella treaty called the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Third question, and very briefly, what is the current situation of the NPT? Well, the current situation of the NPT is very similar to the situation of the whole non-proliferation regime, and I would dare saying even to the situation of every security regime in the world, which, you know, is a situation which is characterized by tensions, by a sort of competition about big powers. As a professor in international law recently said, there is a lot of appetite for posturing around, and there is a very small appetite for consensus. And that's very, very bad for multilateralism. We have witnessed the dismantlement of very important non-proliferation instruments over the last 2 to 3 years. And there is a widespread sense of fatigue, of stagnation. There is a sense that, you know, within the framework of this regime, we cannot further reach steps ahead in terms of non-proliferation and disarmament. There are some who say that the problem is that the current non-proliferation legal framework is not compatible with this new international reality in which there is multipolarism, several big actors with very different agenda, with very different regional conflicts, which make the whole non-proliferation regime much more complex than it was in the 60s and the 70s when this big non-proliferation treaty saw the light. So this is the starting point. And in order to analyze the different aspects of the non-proliferation regime and the NPT, we have with us 6 professors, which will help us to, you know, to discover different aspects of the treaty. I'd like to start by some reflections on the history, on the roots of the treaty. And for that, I would be given the floor to Dr. Elbahtimy. Dr. Elbahtimy is a lecturer in science and security at King's College. He's associate researcher at the Nuclear Knowledge Program at Sciences Po in Paris, and he's the convener of the Global Nuclear Order Working Group at BISA. Hassan's research to date has focused on 2 main areas: the interplay between science and global security, particularly the politics of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, and the history and modern politics of the Middle East. He has published extensively on these 2 aspects. Well, concerning the NPT, he has been working at narratives about the origin of the treaty and what he calls the great powers collusion narrative, which is a very interesting term. So, Hassan, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and it's great to be on this panel. I'd like to thank Megan for organizing it, and all the panelists for joining. And I really also want to thank the audience, many of whom I've learned so much from across the years. So I don't have much time, so I intend this to be, and I hope you can all hear me, I intend this to be a quick provocation. So I want to say ultimately that you asked the question about what is the NPT, and what I want to say is that the way we've been thinking about the NPT is very much embedded into a Cold War narrative, and this is insufficient to explain the origins, the trajectory, or the politics of the treaty. And this is where I really want to emphasize. So I'll try to unpick parts of that narrative, and then show you very quickly why that is insufficient, and then try to open up by saying like why a different and alternative narrative of the origins of and the trajectory of the treaty can help us specifically understand the politics of the treaty as it currently stands, but also different notions of responsibility and accountability as part of that regime. So the common narrative, I think, is very much tied to the Cold War, and this idea that this is a treaty that is a product of strictly US-Soviet Union pact. So basically, this is a bilateral superpowers affair. There is the focus in the narrative on the fate of multilateral forces in Europe and how the resolution of this unlocked the path to the treaty. there is also a lot of thinking and analysis that ties the origins of the treaty to basically a resolution of the nuclear problem in the European theater, or as a response to China's nuclear tests. I mean, all these, I think, are very important parts of the narrative, but I don't think they cover the whole story. In terms of the why this narrowing down is taking place, and I think it's like, if you look analytically, like if you're interested in IR, so the realists and liberals both follow consequential logic when it comes to norms, and have a strict sort of like emphasis on great powers. Constructivists have a constitutive logic of norms, which opens up new analytical spaces, but their ideas of agency are usually commonly tied to a certain group of middle powers and some transnational NGOs and international organizations. So what I would argue is that both have a limited view of agency and ultimately take a reductive hierarchical approach to power. So this is analytically. Historically, there's been, and actually I'd encourage everyone to look into some of the sources that were released recently on the occasion of the 50th anniversary by the US, Russia, and the UK on the origins of the treaty. But this goes to my point, that there is an overwhelming presence of certain narratives coming from the archives of key actors, which is very good to look into the treaty, but provides only, sort of reinforces that narrative, because these are viewed from the perspective of these countries. Finally, the narrowing down, I think, is happening because of political convenience at the moment. There is the appreciation that there is a demise of arms control as an institution, and this brings some form of Cold War nostalgia and the need to build areas of convergence, specifically between US and Russia, which draws on sometimes the NPT as a shining example of collaboration between the two countries, which I would say also sort of reinforces that narrative. So what I would like to say is, all these, my argument is that all these factors are actually important and key, and these countries played a very big role in the evolution of the treaty and the regime. But I think an exclusive focus on them misses some of the key dynamics that are taking place. And I think if you look into the history of the NPT, and I think there are currently a few projects that promise to do that in a very interesting way. If you look into the history of the treaty, you find some of the middle powers and actors play a really important and key role. So we tend to forget that the whole initiative started by Ireland proposing an agenda item in the UN, and ultimately ending up with the Irish resolution on what was called back then the non-dissemination rather than the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. But also, if you look into agency beyond Europe, you see, like, from a very early stage that a lot of the non-aligned countries, even the Afro-Asian countries, sort of putting forward ideas about a nuclear-free world in terms of either nuclear disarmament, but also nuclear non-proliferation. So there is a bit on nuclear weapons in the Bandung 1955 summit. The 1964 African summit included a declaration on the denuclearization of Africa. So these ideas sort of like had a genealogy that goes further back, and actually asked all states that Africa summit, particularly those possessing nuclear weapons, to conclude non-dissemination agreements. The NAM summit in 1964, heads of states, of governments participating declared their own readiness not to produce and acquire or test any nuclear weapons. If you take a jump to the 1995, it's very difficult, the Indefinite Extension Conference, it's very difficult really to understand the politics and dynamics of that conference without really acknowledging the big role played by Canada and South Africa. So I don't have much time. I just want to lay out some of the components of this narrative and how that is, like, if you open up and look into a broader sort of history of the treaty, not only in terms of the key dominant actors, but also some of the actors that contributed to the development of the idea, kind of like presents some challenges to this narrative that is basically that this is just the product of the US and Russia, back then the Soviet Union, which I think does not do justice to the history of this treaty. So the key thing that I want to emphasize here is that the importance of looking at the agency of some of these actors. And I think that is important for those of us who follow the NPT review conference and the review process, because the discussion there, if you follow these conferences, and I've been going to them since 2010, is actually to a large extent focused on disarmament. And a lot of people who actually follow the review process and sort of like keep an eye on news and narratives about nuclear politics are sometimes shocked that, you know, ideas on disarmament play such a big and massive role at the review conference and the review process. And I think that surprise comes in part because of wholeheartedly embracing that vision that this is just a US-Soviet Union pact, and therefore why are these countries talking about disarmament? If you follow like a broader understanding of how this developed, and if you provide agency to some of the countries over there, then you won't be surprised that this is the case. Finally, I want to say like why this is important. I think this is important because it opens up questions of responsibility and accountability within the regime. And in that sense, it provides us, those who are interested in analyzing the politics of the regime and the treaty, of a way of looking into how we actually ended up with the global nuclear order that we currently are in, and the responsibility of actors, not only the great powers, but also some of the middle powers, in sort of like building that order and regime. And with this acknowledgement of the responsibility comes the question of accountability and how to make use of this agency. So this basically is my intervention, and I hope I have not taken more time than I'm supposed to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hassan, for such an insightful view of the NPT from a historical perspective. I would stick to an idea that you have expressed, in the sense that the genealogy of many things that happened after the NPT can be already traced in the NPT negotiations. That's a very interesting idea. Now I would pass the floor on to Professor Megan Dee. Megan is a lecturer in international politics in the Division of History, Heritage and Politics at the University of Stirling. Her work addresses international performance, negotiation, diplomacy and decision-making in international politics, with a particular interest in the European Union. Her current research focuses on the conceptualization and evaluation of actors, group and individual states' performances with international organizations, with a special focus on global nuclear diplomacy and world trade politics. Her interest, or her basic interest about NPT, group dynamics, particularly covering European Union, group interplays, but she's also looking at the CEN, which is probably one of the most interesting initiatives in the last months. You know, the CEN is the acronym of Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament. It was initially a US initiative, but now it has opened up to many different actors. So Megan, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ignacio, and thank you everyone, to Biza especially for hosting us this morning. So I'll keep my comments to just a few points. I think it goes without saying that the NPT has seen significant challenges in recent years, especially. Frictions are growing between the largest nuclear armed states, particularly regional non-proliferation challenges are developing in severity. But also, I would say that the effectiveness of multilateralism itself is actually coming ever more into doubt. And for me, it's that dimension of effective multilateralism that I'm really particularly interested, and specifically the role that groups and networks have played and can continue to play in generating what we might identify as effective multilateral solutions to building consensus and actually delivering on those core obligations of the NPT. And I would argue that group politics has really grown in significance in the past 20, but probably more noticeably last 10 years. And in the last 10 years, the NPT has seen several new groups forming. Since 2010, let's say the informal group of 16, which sort of morphed into something else now, but worked together in the lead up to the 2015 review conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. We also saw the creation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Initiative, the NPDI. And we've also seen much more in the way of plurilateral coordination and initiatives or approaches between groups of states in this forum. So the P5 process, for example, which was launched in 2009, is a particular testimony of that. And if anything, I would say it's a real signifier that even the P5 recognized a need to coordinate as a group in this forum. In the last year especially, we have seen the SEND initiative, as Ignacio had mentioned, the Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament, and its working group launched by the US. Sweden also has formalized just this in the last few months, the Stockholm Initiative on Nuclear Disarmament, which is that focus very much on the stepping stones approach. Coupled to that also, we are seeing a much more active EU, and this past year alone has seen the EU plumb 1.3 million euros into outreach activities that are coordinated by the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs, all intended to generate ideas, points for consensus, and a potential roadmap for providing a successful outcome for the next NPT review conference. Now, it's a point of discussion as to the success of that in light of COVID, but nevertheless, the activity is there. All told, I would say that groups fundamentally matter in the NPT, but there are two implications, I would say, of group politics I think really do need to be highlighted. The first implication of group politics is actually for effective multilateralism itself. I think we should recognize that there is an enormous contribution that groups can and do play in managing complexity within multilateral nuclear diplomacy and in contributing to consensus building efforts. Saying that, there is considerable risk, I would say, of group efforts proliferating to such an extent that the NPT review negotiations cease to be effective and cease to actually even be the core forum for deliberating its actual obligations. We've seen signs of this already with the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons conferences, followed by the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was negotiated in the UN General Assembly. But it's also, I mean, generally speaking, we can identify this in other policy fields. It's not unique to nuclear diplomacy. I mean, I do some work on trade politics as well, and you just have to look at what happened with the impasse and the deadlock within the WTO's Doha round and the shift toward plurilateral and even bilateral deal making. It highlights a proclivity towards forum shopping, where states hunt for the best forum to try and negotiate with one another. My fear is that the SEND initiative, particularly, the fact that it's US backed especially, could be a signifier of just that same sort of shift within the NPT, with SEND becoming more of a potential alternative to the NPT and not necessarily another group contributor to the NPT. And I think that's probably a point to highlight. My second implication, I would say, regarding group politics is the balance of group politics within the NPT. And I would argue that sort of after the 2010 review conference, the humanitarian dimension really dominated the discourse within the NPT. I mean, to the point where you could almost argue that, at least in terms of balance of narrative, we were actually starting to see some rebalancing of the power symmetry between nuclear and non-nuclear armed states, if nothing else, just due to the sheer weight of numbers behind the humanitarian initiative. I suspect, however, that rebalancing is somewhat fleeting. In the current NPT review cycle, those competing paradigms of strategic nuclear security and human security, which the humanitarian dimension really captures, is actually seeing a much heavier reweighting towards groups to focus on the security dimension again. So the MPDI, the SEND initiative, the Stockholm initiative. You just have to look at the language for the EU, the Arab group, the non-aligned movement. All of their language is focused very much, far less on the humanitarian dimension and much more on the security dimension. Whilst the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons does, of course, provide a major rallying point for non-nuclear armed states in advocating nuclear weapon prohibition, it's also providing a point of discontent for those who equally recognize the security challenges associated with nuclear non-proliferation and that necessity to uphold the NPT itself. And if you look at the group formations in this last review cycle, my impressions are, and please, very, very happy to be proven wrong on this point, that the group of states that are associated with that humanitarian dimension are rather less well organized than within the NPT context. Their energies are focused on the TPNW. What we are instead seeing is very much a growing prominence of middle ground security-oriented groups, and question marks do then start to be raised over the ongoing momentum of the humanitarian presence within the NPT discourse since TPNW came into force. Oh, sorry, not into force, but came into being. So really just to sum up, I would say that really just stress that point that, that groups matter. And I think potentially hold the key to building and finding and building consensus in this forum. But the latest group politics does signal a challenge to the effective multilateralism of the NPT, and that we as researchers really need to be able to get a better handle on. And I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Megan, for such a comprehensive view of the current context of the NPT. You know, in this world, one has to be very careful when using the word proliferation, but I really think that there is a proliferation of non-proliferation initiatives in these last years, and this makes the regime much more complex. And there is a question mark indeed about the compatibility between the traditional instruments and these new non-proliferation and arms control initiatives. So thank you very much for that. Now I pass the floor to Professor Kienzle. Ben Kienzle is a senior lecturer and lead of the Defense and Diplomacy Research team at the King's College. He holds a PhD in International Relations from Barcelona University and an MA in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of Ulster. Ben Kienzle's research spans the fields of international security, global governance, and regional integration. His work focuses broadly on international security cooperation, and specific subjects include the international control of nuclear weapons, European security, and the foreign and defense dimension of Brexit, which in my view is a very interesting and controversial point. He has been working recently on regime complexity and how a larger nuclear non-proliferation regime complex has evolved together with its strengths and drawbacks from both non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament. Ben, you have the floor.
Well, Ignacio, thank you very much. That was very kind of you. And thank you to Megan for inviting me to this panel. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to join this panel to discuss about the NPT at its 50th anniversary. And well, looking back at the treaty's history, 50 years of history, through my own research lens of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, which Ignacio already outlined in his original intervention. So I think what we can see as a dominant feature of this history of the NPT is the development of a complex web of numerous international agreements and institutions and informal arrangements that in one way or another are linked to the NPT. So when we talk about the NPT nowadays, and its essentially, just to reiterate Ignacio's original point, we don't talk about a single treaty, but we talk about what we might want to call a broader nuclear non-proliferation regime complex. And even say that we cannot understand the NPT without actually looking at the broader regime that exists. And generally, I'd argue that it's fair to say that the existence of a broader regime, of a lot of different regime elements, has strengthened the NPT and has certainly helped to cement the treaty's main successes that Ignacio has outlined already, not least the fact that nowadays we have 9 nuclear weapon states and not 20 or 30 as many expected in the 1960s. So at this stage, my original intention was to outline briefly how these different regime elements, starting with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the expert control groups, the nuclear weapon-free zones, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, or more recently, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540, have kind of strengthened the NPT. After looking at the audience, I've realized that the audience is actually full of experts who would probably know what I wanted to say. So suffice to say here that I think that we have nowadays a regime that has still the NPT at its core, but that has grown tremendously. And most importantly, I think if we look at all these different regime elements, it has closed loopholes left by the NPT. We might want to think, for example, about the expert control groups. And it has expanded the scope of the NPT. Let's think here, for example, about UN Security Council Resolution 1540, which was designed to prevent for the first time the acquisition of WMD, including nuclear weapons, by non-state actors, whereas traditionally, of course, the NPT and the broader regime is concerned with nation states. And quite frankly, the complexity of the regime that exists today is quite mind-boggling. But since we have in the audience a group of experts in my short intervention now, I just want to focus, let's say, on some of the challenges that this regime complex creates for the NPT and the working of the NPT more broadly. And I'd say, despite the overall positive assessment of the NPT that we shouldn't forget, there are numerous challenges. And the first one is one that we will probably hear more about during today's panel, and that's an issue of justice. So obviously we all know that the NPT is discriminatory in the sense that we have nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, which is quite unusual of this kind of differentiation in an international treaty. But I think if we look at this from the perspective of how the broader regime complex around the NPT has evolved, the problem is that the growing regime has developed mainly in such a way that it serves the interests of the nuclear weapon states and some of their allies in the specific non-proliferation aspect of the NPT. So non-proliferation nowadays, or the non-proliferation pillar of the NPT, is really strong, not least because many of these additional regime elements that have evolved actually strengthen non-proliferation per se. But the other elements, the other two pillars, nuclear energy and in particular nuclear disarmament, that are part of the NPT, they have been addressed in the regime, more broadly speaking, in a substantially less significant way. And all this has created a high level of discontent amongst the nuclear disarmament supporters, especially in the global south. And over time, I think the danger is, and it's not an issue right now, I would say, but over time, the danger is that these states support increasingly less the NPT in the broader regime complex because they perceive it as being unjust, because it develops in a way that they believe what was not intended by those who signed the NPT now over 50 years ago. And the second somehow interrelated challenge is that multilateralism, and I'm talking here about multilateralism as a principle of international relations, as an idea that is out there of how international relations can work, gets increasingly challenged, not least by the historically strongest supporter of multilateralism, and that is the United States. Now, at the end of the day, the NPT and the broader regime complex around it rests on the belief that multilateralism, having treaties, having international organizations, having informal international arrangements, works. And if this belief vanishes over time, the whole construct on which the NPT and the broader regime, for that matter, rest becomes unstable. And we can argue, and perhaps that's an issue for the Q&A, we can argue that we see this already when we look at major arms control agreements from which the United States has withdrawn in recent years, in particular the INF Treaty, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and most recently Open Sky. And this leads me now very briefly to a third and final challenge that I'd like to highlight, and that is great power rivalry. So although perhaps Hassan might not agree with, or not entirely with what I have to say, we heard in Hassan's talk about great, or the idea or the narrative of great power collusion that, well, I would say was a key to the success of the NPT, especially in the early stages. So that the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union agreed was key. But nowadays, the challenge is that we're increasingly moving away from great power collusion in the framework of the NPT and the broader regime. Now, I think, as we can easily see in the news, US-Chinese rivalry has become more pronounced, US-Russia relations at a low point, and more generally, P5 agreement on substantial nuclear issues is really difficult to get, as you can see in the P5 process, a forum that brings together the nuclear experts of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And I believe there are people who are much more knowledgeable about this in the audience. So really, to wrap up very briefly, all in all, I say my bottom line is, well, we have good reasons to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the NPT. We shouldn't forget that. We are still on solid ground in the form of a broad and strong regime complex around the NPT. And I think that holds true for the foreseeable future, but we cannot take these achievements for granted. So on this note, and hopefully rather positive note, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions in the Q&A. Thank you. Ignacio, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. In fact, you touched upon in my view, what is the key aspect of the current situation of the non-proliferation regime, which is complexity, and how to manage complexity, how to make compatible the traditional instruments which with the new initiatives, and the regulatory instruments with the normative one. It's a very challenging aspect. Now I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Laura Considine, who is going to tackle one, in my view, of the most original and innovative perspectives of the NPT, which is the NPT seen from a linguistic perspective, or the perspective of a linguist. Dr. Considine is a lecturer in international relations, specializing in global nuclear politics. She received her Master of Letters in International Security Studies from the University of St. Andrews in 2010, and her PhD in International Politics from Edinburgh University in 2014. She has been a Kluge Fellow at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. in 2011. And her research interests includes issues of language and meaning in the politics of nuclear weapons. She's also interested in broader Cold War history, nuclear disarmament, and international relations theory. She has been working on the role of language in shaping what is and isn't seen as possible in the NPT process, and in particular, she will be touching on the impact on the Treaty of strategic use of language. Laura, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It is Great to be virtually among friends and those interested in nuclear politics. So thank you, Bisa, for providing this opportunity to talk about the NPT at 50 and to Megan for organizing. So we were asked to talk about our pet projects in relation to the NPT, and my pet project, as you heard, is language and how it shapes and limits the forms of what's politically possible in nuclear politics. So in relation to considering the issues and challenges for the NPT after 50 years, there's 3 points I'd like to make about how language matters. So the first thing I'd like to note is how important certain words and phrases have and can be in the practice of NPT politics. So one good example of this is the inclusion in 2010 for the first time ever of humanitarian language in the final outcome document, which expressed its quote, deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, and reaffirmed the needs for all states at all times to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. So this language was not given a huge amount of attention at the time. Indeed, Rebecca Davis-Gibbons notes that advocates were advised not to make a big deal of this, or it might be removed from the document. But it served as a marker that campaigners could continually point to in the following years for further activism, and a jumping off point for statements at subsequent PrepCons and the 2015 RevCon, and for the initiative broadly. So this piece of language really mattered. The second thing I wanted to say is to point out the implications of the dominant framing in language of the NPT as a grand bargain. So this ubiquitous description sets the process of the NPT as a quid pro quo. The nuclear weapon states will do certain things and the non-nuclear weapon states will reciprocate, and vice versa. So there are scholars of NPT history, including Hassan, that can talk about the accuracy of this in terms of the negotiating record much better than I can. But let me just say that I think that one part of the rhetorical work that the grand bargain frame does is to establish any movement on disarmament from the nuclear weapon states as a concession to non-nuclear weapon states. So this framing of sacrifice both implicitly reasserts the value of nuclear weapons and undercuts the NPT idea of equal responsibilities for disarmament. So I think another thing to reflect on for the future is our continued use of this in research and teaching. Finally, and perhaps this is a less concrete point, but for me maybe the most interesting, I wanted to talk about the role about established language and tropes and contradictions in how the NPT is generally discussed. So the intro to most think pieces or articles about the NPT will likely contain the word cornerstone, or perhaps foundation or bedrock. The NPT is the cornerstone of the non-proliferation regime and the global nuclear order. The think piece may well go on to assert that the NPT is also under threat. I did some online searching and I found the NPT described as fragile, shaky, vulnerable, under threat, under pressure, eroding, at breaking point, plus discussions of high stakes and fault lines, grave and inauspicious moments, and so on. There is a simultaneous assertion of the foundational importance of this treaty and its imminent demise, where the NPT is validated both as bedrock and fragility. I'm not saying that the NPT is unimportant or denying that the broader situation is less positive than it has looked in previous years, but the NPT's demise has been predicted for many decades now. For example, in 98 after India and Pakistan's test, which was right after indefinite extension. This demise is usually predicted in the same breath as the always unchallenged assertion of its critical importance. More to the point though, what I'm saying is that the reproduction of this discourse of fragility and foundation leads to accepting an ongoing state of crisis, where a permanent threat of total systemic collapse is always attached to any discussion of non-proliferation and disarmament politics. So what are the consequences of this? I think that one can be summed up by a recent UK FCO disarmament blog, which asserted that within the difficult context of this current NPT review cycle that, quote, expectations are low. If we are in a state of crisis, we're just happy to get through it, right? The implication of this specific crisis talk is that this is not really the time to look forward or do anything bold, but to shore up the foundations of an order under threat. So my kind of general point is that reproducing this discourse of the NPT as fragile foundation has political implications for how we understand the challenges to the NPT, plus any possible solutions that we can have. So I think that's my 5 minutes. I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Laura, for providing us with a very interesting and innovative perspective on language. Well, it is no secret that non-proliferation, as I guess any security regime, is full of commonplaces and an agreed language. And one of them is the fact that, you know, in a time of crisis such as this one, we should not be making steps ahead because it is not a good moment. You know, if you go through history, you find out that almost every achievement in terms of non-proliferation and disarmament was made or was agreed in critical times. So I don't particularly agree with this fact that we should be waiting till, you know, a fantastic moment in order to try to pursue new progress in this region. Thank you very much for that. Now we will pass the floor to Professor Ritchie. Nick Ritchie researches and teaches in the areas of international relations and international security at the University of York. He had previously spent 4 years at Bradford's Department of Peace Studies and worked for 5 years at the Oxford Research Group, an independent non-governmental organization working on the challenges of global security and nuclear disarmament. His particular focus is on nuclear disarmament, proliferation and arms control, and US and UK national security. Regarding the NPT, he has worked on the possibilities of nuclear disarmament in terms of the global politics of nuclear order, its structures of power and resistance, ideologies of nuclearism and anti-nuclearism, and the legitimation and delegitimation of nuclear weapons. Nick, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'll try and keep my remarks brief. Nice to see so many familiar faces in this weird lockdown twilight zone that we're still find ourselves in. I'm going to just say a few words about my recent research and writing on power and resistance in the global politics of nuclear weapons that's drawn on my experiences in the humanitarian initiative and the ban treaty process over the last sort of 10 years or so. I think we need to start by recognizing two things when we reflect on the last 50 years. One is how deeply embedded nuclear weapons have become in national and global politics and strategic cultures over the life of the NPT. And the second is how heavily contested that remains. And it's the relationship between the two that's led to the current characterization of the NPT and the broader regime complex as generally being polarized. And the humanitarian initiative and the ban treaty are certainly symptomatic of that polarization. And I think they've made it more explicit, but they're certainly not a cause of it, but they've made it more explicit and more defined to the point where I think we can speak now of two pretty clear nuclear worldviews or nuclear ontologies. The first of these that I've set out in a paper recently is a hierarchical, hegemonic, global nuclear control order. And by that I mean the now well-established set of practices that selectively legitimize and regulate and discipline the development and the use of nuclear technologies and nuclear knowledge. It's an order that's dominated by the US, but it's certainly not reducible to it. And it's embedded in a broader set of power structures in world politics, particularly the nuclear oligarchy of the P5 and NPT nuclear weapon states, and the wider Western nuclear protectorate that maps on to global wealth and power in the capitalist economic system. This hierarchical and unequal nuclear order has been subject to cycles of resistance and ongoing contestation, most recently through the ban treaty. And I argue in another article with Tjove Egland, who's with us today, nice to see you, Tjove, that the ban treaty is an expression of collective resistance to those aspects of nuclear hegemony and practices of nuclear control that continue to legitimize and perpetuate the existence of nuclear weapons, the practice of nuclear deterrence, and with it, the continuing risk of nuclear violence. And this reflects a second fairly concrete now nuclear worldview understood in terms of anti-nuclearism. It's one that reflects the diverse experiences, nuclear experiences of the comparatively weak and subordinate and disempowered majority of states in nuclear politics, mainly from the global south, as well as civil society organizations, and importantly for the humanitarian initiative, the victims of nuclear weapons from Japan and the world's nuclear testing grounds. And this worldview organized around anti-nuclearism emphasizes overlapping, intersecting structures of inequality and injustice, tends to place human beings and societies at its center as its core referent. And I argue that it does so through four broad overlapping discursive themes that foreground violence, particularly against human bodies from nuclear weapons detonations, post-colonial relations in global nuclear politics, and gender and environmentalism. And it's not homogeneous by any means. It reflects many different experiences and identities and conceptions of nuclear subordination at the intersections of gender and race, and violence and ecology, and technology and geography. But it is a quite different nuclear worldview, a quite different nuclear ontology to one that centers on weapons, states, deterrence, counterproliferation, and strategic stability. So after 50 years of the NPT, which remains a core institution of global nuclear politics and does so in both of these contexts, both as part of a hegemonic nuclear control order, understood as a deeply embedded structure of power, and as a locus of resistance through a diverse anti-nuclearism. And I think we can best understand the global politics of nuclear weapons, and in particular the politics of nuclear disarmament, as a dialectic between these two, between the practices, the power structures and ideologies of nuclearism and anti-nuclearism, not least because they can only be understood in relation to each other. So that's what I've been interested in, that's what I've been researching and writing on. So I'll leave my remarks there, but just to be a little provocative, I'll ask a question as to whether what you think the odds might be of the United States being a member state of the NPT at the end of a second term of Trump.
Thank you very much, Nick, for such a provocative intervention. Indeed, one of the big questions is about the impact of the humanitarian perspective and the ban treaty on the whole non-proliferation regime. As a matter of fact, as you perfectly know, the abolitionist perspective was already there long before the ban treaty, even in the UNAEC discussions back in the 50s, and then in the 10 Nations Committee, and so on and so forth. But it has clearly been reinforced with the ban treaty. Now I will pass the floor to Clara Portela, who is a Spanish national, like I am. Dr. Portela is a senior associate analyst at the EU Institute for Security Studies, having previously served as a full-time faculty member at the University of Valencia and also at the Singapore Management University. She holds a PhD from the European University Institute in Florence and an MA from the Free University of Berlin. Her research focuses on arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament, as well as on multilateral sanctions policies. She has been recently working at the ban treaty and its compatibility and prospects for coexistence with the NPT, and also she has been working on sanctions as a non-proliferation tool. Clara, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, and I would also like to thank Megan for having invited me to this almost brainstorming session, I would say. So, since I'm the last speaker, I'm going to keep my comments really short, or at least as short as I can. What I would like to talk about is what I would describe as the coercive turn in the NPT framework, or let's say in the non-proliferation process. And towards the end, I will also try to identify some consequences for the NPT framework or for the NPT review process. So basically, what I refer to when I talk about a coercive turn is is basically a movement towards emphasizing unilateral, non-consensual, coercive, basically, elements in the NPT framework that did not used to be part of the broader non-proliferation regime in the past. So basically, I would locate this coercive turn in the first decade of this century, around the years 2000, well, basically in the post-Iraq phase. This coercive turn has been mostly reflected in the use of sanctions in order to enforce non-proliferation, which is a development that is not entirely new, because the US has been piloting the use of sanctions and has actually been imposing sanctions in order to advance non-proliferation goals already since the 1970s. So basically, the US has been a pioneer in this area. It has promoted also the use of sanctions to advance non-proliferation goals elsewhere, particularly trying to persuade its allies to follow suit. However, in the past, well, or prior to this, well, to the mid, well, to the past decade, these efforts have only been partially successful. However, what we witnessed in the first years of the century is that the UN has increasingly adopted this approach to enforcing proliferation. The most visible sign can be found in the Resolution 1540 of the year 2004, which has already been mentioned today. But particularly, it is in the year 2006 when the UN starts imposing multilateral sanctions regimes for, well, in order to counter the proliferation efforts in North Korea and Iran. This more or less takes place at the same time. And these sanctions regimes that are actually very robust, they basically start that year. The only precedent can be found in the case of, well, in the sanctions against Iraq, which had already been imposed in the 1990s, as we know. However, the very stringent disarmament obligations imposed on Iraq and supported by a very comprehensive embargo, they had taken place in the context of a post-conflict situation following the invasion of Kuwait and the withdrawal of Iraq from Kuwait. So this, let's say, created a specific context for the promotion of, or the limitation of armaments in the case of Iraq. But this is not the case. Well, I mean, the situation is completely different in the case of North Korea and Iran, because there has been no interstate or even civil war that has that has provided a opportunity for the UN Security Council to impose the sanctions. So basically, the sanctions regimes are exclusively for non-proliferation objectives. So the change here, or the turning point, takes place precisely when the sanctions policies that Washington had already had in place for a while, and also other third actors, receive a UN Security Council seal. And this actually constitutes also a turning point for the European Union. The European Union had actually resisted the idea of imposing sanctions in order to promote proliferation objectives. However, after the UN Security Council imposes these measures, the EU fully participates in this sanctions regime. And it does not only stringently implement the sanctions mandated by the UN Security Council, but it actually goes beyond the letter of the resolutions in order to impose additional measures that are partly agreed with Washington, but that go very much beyond what the UN Security Council resolution had mandated. So some scholars, such as Grégoire Ballard from the Graduate Institute in Geneva, has even claimed that in the context of this sanctions enterprise, this sanctions operation, the non-proliferation norm has expanded. So it actually covers, if we look at what the UN Security Council mandate enforces, it actually covers aspects that did not used to be part of the non-proliferation regime before. And what is interesting about this development is that the EU, which had started its own action in non-proliferation in the year 2003 with the strategy, the release of the first strategy against the spread of WMD, released very much in conjunction with the European security strategy, that was also, well, that was published pretty much at the time that also identified the proliferation of WMD as a key threat to European security. The EU had not originally foreseen in its strategy to emphasize coercive elements. Actually, if we look at EU action over the first years after the release of the strategy, the emphasis was very much on supporting non-proliferation efforts via funding. So basically, they provided funding for programs that were run by the relevant international organizations, such as the International Atomic Energy Agency. They also provided additional funding for other UN agencies active in disarmament. And this is actually a practice that has never stopped. So the EU has very much emphasized the idea that these organizations have to be sufficiently funded in order to develop their activities. Then there was also a lot of emphasis on the insertion of WMD clauses, or basically conditionality clauses, in agreements with third countries, which are actually also a consensual instrument. But sanctions had actually not been part of these activities until the UN Security Council became active in this regard. And actually, if we look at EU activity over recent years, we can even see how it has embraced the idea of using sanctions in other fields of WMD activity. So a couple of years ago, the Council adopted a sanctions regime addressing the use and proliferation of chemical weapons, which is an area in which the EU had also been quite active, but it had refrained from activating any coercive instruments in the past. So what is interesting about this coercive turn is that it has coincided more or less in time with the emergence of the humanitarian initiative and subsequently of the Ban Treaty. And basically it has preceded a point in time in which the NPT community is described as being increasingly polarized. So all this leads me to to the implications. Basically, I identify two implications here. One of them is that the use of sanctions, which has been embraced by the EU and basically other actors. I mean, it's not a novelty from the point of view of the US, because the US have been using this instrument for a much longer time. But now that it has become more widespread, I mean, what we can identify is that there was certainly an intention to reinforce the non-proliferation regime by adopting also coercive elements. But the question is whether this has actually led to a reinforcement or to a strengthening of the regime, or whether it has contributed to its weakening, in the sense that it has led to more polarization and it has increased the dissatisfaction of the large majority of the NPT community, which are non-nuclear weapon states, which resent the use of coercive instruments against those members that seem to deviate from the non-proliferation norm. And secondly, and most importantly, from the point of view of the EU, which is basically my main object of research, the EU is also increasingly leaving the middle ground that it used to represent. Not only because most members of the EU are concurrently NATO members, so obviously the EU is seen as being closer to the attitude of particularly the US when it comes to non-proliferation and disarmament, and because it used to host or to have two nuclear powers among its members. Now we are down to one. But basically, the fact that the entire organization associates itself with these coercive instruments is also making it more difficult for the EU to present itself as a middle ground entity within the broader NPT family. So I hope that I didn't take too much time. Thank you very much, Ignacio.
Thank you very much, Clara. And you touched upon a very important point, which is the growing wave of sanctions in not only the non-proliferation regime, but in security regimes as a whole. Now we have like 15 minutes for questions. So I will open the floor to whoever wants to start. Let's see. Well, if I don't see any blue hands raised for the moment. So as an icebreaker, I would like to make, oh, yes, now we have, yes. Sorry if I don't pronounce your name correctly. It's Gaukar Mutsahanova. Please, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. This speaker is not the best. Thank you so very much to all the participants and all the presenters. It is a very weird time indeed, but the upside, I think, is that I get to participate in many of these things that I wouldn't make to otherwise. Anyway, I have many questions, but I was curious about the point that Professor D made about the growing role of groups in the NPT politics, and I was wondering if she'd like to elaborate a bit more in terms of comparing the role of groupings, in particular in the run-up to the 2000 RevCon versus the current role, where we have a lot more of the groupings, some of which have been clearly inspired by the relative success of groups like the New Agenda Coalition. So do we really see a growing role of groupings, or do we just see a growing number of groupings that may or may not have the role that they aspire to have? Thank you.
Hi, sorry. Yes, thank you for that question. It's a really pertinent point you've made, actually. You're right, there was an increase in groups before 2000. We saw the creation of the New Agenda Coalition, etc. where I think my point about growing role is actually more in reference to there has been a proliferation of the number of groups, certainly, but also a proliferation of the number of groups that are intersecting with one another in terms of their group memberships. So when you consider the overlap between these groups in terms of the members that make them up, it's sort of really highlighting if anything, it's highlighting a key role for a number of what I would almost identify as core states in actual fact, who are sort of filtering through these various group dynamics. I mean, I was looking at the list of participants in the SEND initiative's launch last year. And of the sort of 40 or so that were on the list of participants, you know, you're including the entire group of the NPDI. You're including most of the NAC, a good handful of the EU, a good handful from the non-aligned movement. And it's not, the SEND initiative is not alone in that regard. I mean, you look again at the Stockholm initiative that's also come up, and there's this overlap of memberships between, with states parties being involved. And I think that is a really important part of the puzzle in how we understand group politics in the NPT, but also how we understand the potential for consensus building. Because if you can, these states parties, I mean, you think about the Netherlands, for example, Mexico, they have multiple group memberships, and they are playing a very crucial function in sort of information sharing, acting almost like a conduit, where these varying different multiple perspectives are all coming together. And so I think that is growing significance. So I suppose when I refer to the growing role, it's not just the number, it's the interplay and the dynamics between the groups, which I think is becoming more pertinent now.
So thank you very much, Megan. I think we still have time for 2 or 3 more questions. I would be passing the floor to Heather Williams, please.
Great, thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the speakers. This was really fascinating, and it's not quite as good as us all meeting in person, but it was still really, really useful. So I have just a really quick point of clarification about SEND. I think we have to be really careful about talking about SEND in specifically an NPT context, because what makes it really unique is that it has 3 nuclear possessors who participate and are not part of the NPT. And so I totally understand this. I think your presentation was really fascinating about the different groupings. That's just kind of one angle that I think makes it a little bit different. But my question is actually for Nick, Ritchie, but Laura I'd also be interested in Laura's thoughts on this. So Nick, you've described this binary, and I completely agree with your description, and that it is polarized. But I'm wondering, are you seeing the emergence of a new ontology and something kind of more in the middle, based on comments that we heard from Clara, from Hassan and Ben as well, about some of the middle ground states? And it seems like a lot of them feel trapped between these 2 poles and these 2 ontologies, and they're trying to find somewhere in the middle. So I'm wondering if in your research you're seeing that. And then from Laura, how do you think that language is contributing to this polarization and this binary that Nick has outlined? And if so, how? So thank you very much.
Thanks, Heather. I'll briefly respond to that. I mean, we've certainly seen real anxiety amongst a number of states, middle power states, a lot of European states, that's led to the generation of a series of initiatives aimed at getting some kind of consensus outcome, whatever form that might take at NPT, at this review conference, following on the heels of the contentious, fractious 2015 review conference. I think what we have to consider is 2 things. One, that's in the context of a broader sort of international ordering anxiety that we're seeing, precipitated in some considerable way by the election of Trump, but other dynamics there too. So it's in this ongoing continuous anxiety about the state of the NPT, which has a longer trajectory, is part of this, I think, contemporary broader ordering anxiety. That's the first thing. And second, I think we need to be very alive to the stark power asymmetries between those that I associate in this binary with nuclearism and those with anti-nuclearism. And there is a danger, from my perspective, that talk of trying to find a middle ground treats the two different sets of actors on either side of this binary, and you might disagree whether it's a binary, as somehow equal. And the power asymmetries are much, much starker. They're far heavily weighted with those states that buy into the practices, structures, and ideas of nuclearism in terms of power and its various manifestations in world politics. So I think that, and I don't say this is a deliberate strategy, but I think there's an element of co-option here, that middle ground, bridge building, stepping stones is to a certain extent, and for me, I think to a large extent, risks being inadvertent, I wouldn't say deliberate, but certainly inadvertent co-option into what the key powers that adhere to an ideology of nuclearism are prepared to engage with. Yeah, that's how I would frame.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly, I'll be really, really quick. It's very nice to see you, Heather. Thank you for that. And I think my point is really very similar to Nick's, actually, in terms of thinking about how the language of consensus, how the language of responsibility, how that language does very important work in hiding power differences and hiding kind of practices that go and kind of papering over certain differences between Nick's two groups. And I think that all that happening within a broader discursive framing of an age of crisis and of fragility, I think has very important implications for how those sorts of dynamics play out. So I think the language, I mean, I'm going to say this obviously, but I think the language is very interesting and very important in how we conceive of what is the middle ground and what those language does in terms of kind of how it frames the power dynamics that are actually at play here.
Thank you very much, Laura. I hope we will have time for even two more questions. I would pass the floor to Paul Ingram now.
Thank you, Ambassador. My question actually follows on from Heather's and is directed at the same too, I'm afraid. But I wanted to pick up this point about power asymmetries and the dialectic. Because I'm not an academic, as many of you know, but neither am I an activist anymore, used to be, and still passionately anti-nuclear and would call myself an anti-nuclearist, but I have come to realize that just accepting my role as an anti-nuclearist in a dialectic gets me nowhere. And I'm very interested, not in middle ground, but in processes that are integrated and bring people who are anti-nuclear and pro-nuclear together in processes where we listen to each other. And the stepping stones approach, which I was very strongly involved with the Swedes, was not about middle ground or bridge building. It was about this actually a process that includes everybody in the process and recognizes the power differential. So my question is to Nick, both as an activist and an academic, which I know he is, how do you escape power differentials when the power is so heavily on one side, if you choose to be the weaker side, if you choose to stay in the dialectic and on the weaker side? How do you achieve change in that process?
I'll be brief. How do you achieve change? Well, yeah, I'll give you an answer in 30 seconds, and we can all go home. No, and it's a good question, and I understand the work that you were involved in at Basic, Paul, has a very nuanced understanding of processes of change, and it's not just a sort of a read-off list of nice things that we'd like to see the nuclear weapon states do individually or collectively. But I mean, my journey's perhaps gone in a slightly different direction, because I think when we are dealing with embedded structures of power, And it's important in that context to understand global nuclear politics in terms of wider global politics and national and regional politics. Then what ways in which one can actively resist and push against and challenge and foreground the inequities of those structures of power, I think is really important. And that can be done in different ways by different actors. And that is the context through which I came to understand what the humanitarian initiative and the BAM Treaty were all about. But more broadly, I think there is and states aren't homogenous in this. We know this. We know there are actors and narratives and practices within non-nuclear and nuclear armed states that hold different views on the politics of nuclear weapons. But more broadly, over the longer term, I think it is a challenge of changing strategic cultures within states, particularly nuclear weapon states, and the extent to which they're contested in those states and by their allies, or the extent to which they are pretty homogenous and deeply embedded, and avenues for contestation are very limited. Therein lies the challenge, I think. And it may be a very long-term process insofar as changes in strategic culture may require new generations of personnel in state machinery to populate that state machinery. So that's by no means a quick and easy answer, but that's my initial reflection for what it's worth.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to drive our meeting to an end. We touch upon many different aspects of the NPT and the non-proliferation regime, and at the same time we left untouched many others. Personally, I would have been delighted to hear from the panelists, for example, what would we expect from the next NPT REFCON, because there is this commonplace, again, the importance of language in the NPT that says that a successful NPT REFCON is always a REFCON which ends up in a final document adopted by consensus. Would you agree that that would be, a successful NPT REFCON in the light of what has happened, by the way, with previous NPT meetings? In any case, that would be for another occasion. These subjects would give us time for a lot of reflection. I thank everyone for the interventions, and now I would pass on the floor to Dee to close the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ignacio.